This is on. All right, we're like close to the same height. I don't know where this needs to be. All right, is it on? It is on. All right, good morning, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Natasha Wilkins.
And my name is Madeline Polovic.
And we are going to present, we're both from ISB, we're going to present on English learner students in evidence-based funding. That is the session you are in. So just very quickly, a little bit about me. I am a Senior Resource Allocation Policy Specialist. That is a long title at ISB. My prior experience, I was a classroom teacher before then transitioning to law school with the goal of really thinking about how can we create a greater equity-based education model. And then that led me to ISB, where now I am the leader working with the evidence-based funding spending plan.
And I'll give a little bit of background on myself. So I'm with the multilingual department. I've been at ISB now in this department for 2 years. I might be a consultant for some of your districts, anyone in this audience. I'm also the coordinator for the State Seal of Biliteracy program. So if your district is participating in that, awesome. If not, then I encourage you to look up the Seal of Biliteracy on our website. It's not too late to apply. You can still apply. A little bit more background on myself. I came to Chicago with the intention of building a career at the intersection of social justice and education. Started off by dedicating some years to AmeriCorps service, and that led me to ISB, where, again, been with multilingual department, and and here we are today, talking about evidence-based funding.
And I will just also add, I've been at ISB only since July, so I'm here to learn from you all just as much as I'm here to share. So please share any insights that you have. I'm willing to take them in, and I desire to take them in. We're gonna start with a quick poll just to see who's in the room. So if you wanna get out your phones, you can either go to www.menti.com and type in that code up there, or you can scan the QR code. We're just gonna take a quick poll, see who's in the room. You know who we are, and we would love to know who you are. And internet is doing internet things. Perfect. This is so cool. So we're seeing a few more come in. It looks like a lot of people in the room have engaged with the EBF Spending Plan before. We have a few returning bilingual directors who have not engaged with it before. We have, looks like, a lot of new bilingual directors that have not engaged with the EBF Spending Plan. Right now, it looks like that is the largest group we have in the room. Excellent. Well, this is exactly where you need to be if you have not engaged with the EBF Spending Plan before with your district. So we've got a lot of information to share with you, and as I said, we're looking for your thoughts as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maddie.
Great. So here we have our agenda for today. Again, this session is specifically, of course, catered towards how EBF and English learners are sort of all in this same pot. We're going to be talking about how can districts collaboratively decide to spend or decide how to spend their EBF money, again, specifically as it's attributable to ELs. And then finally, just sort of talking about the opportunities to support districts, specifically surrounding planning, as well as thinking about how can we strengthen our EBF spending plan redesign. That is our big piece currently. So I'll just be diving into this first section, talking about how and what of EBF is attributable to ELs, how is it calculated, because there is math involved. So in FY18, the EBF funding was, well, actually, I should back up. It was signed into law in August of 2017, and basically what it did is it combined 5 previously existing grants. So that included, the general state aid, it included English learner education funding, as well as 3 separate special ed grants. So the dollar amounts from those 5 grants were combined into one funding pot, which we call the base funding minimum. So what the base funding minimum did for at least the start of EBF was to ensure that for that year, districts would be receiving the same amount of money that they would have received for all of these 5 separate grants. So now it was just consolidating into one pot, making it a lot easier. Sorry, let me back up. So we have sort of that starter money, and then we have on top of that additional money, which we call tiered funding, and that's really sort of what I'm going to get into with the meat and potatoes of this. So again, to keep it succinct, the money from these grants never went away, they just got combined, and then we have additional money on top of that we have attributed to 3 student population groups: ELs, special ed, and low income. Okay. So one of the key components of EBF is that the dollar amounts are going to accumulate each year. So every year, districts will never receive less funding in EBF than they received the previous year. They will, at minimum, receive that. Oh my gosh, they will. Oh, I have to. Oh, there we go. My apologies. So again, like I was saying, districts will at minimum receive the same amount of funding. They will never receive less. Oh, that is not what I meant to click on. Okay. So like I mentioned, we have the base funding minimum, and then on top of that, we have the tier funding. Again, and this is specifically thinking about, okay, well, how are English learners involved in this funding stream? So then thinking about moving to FY19, how that funding worked now that we already have established EBF. The FY19 funding took the total amount that districts received in FY18. So that was the base funding minimum plus the tier funding, and then that total amount became the base funding for FY19. Then with FY19, districts then received on top of that the additional tier funding. See how like every year it kind of accumulates? I will say for last year, there was no tier funding. So that was like the one year there was no tier funding. But this year we do have tier funding coming in. So districts will be receiving, and especially if you have already done your EBF spending plan, which I hope you all have, then you would have seen that there is the student allocated funding in there. So, okay. So here we kind of get into the EL allocations for EBF. So again, when thinking about the actual dollar amounts that are provided, we have base funding minimum stemming from that original FY17 EL grant, and then the tier funding on top of that. So the tier funding is calculated, the tier funding is calculated based off of cost factors for ELs. So these are basically what does it cost at minimum to educate this group of students. So that includes salaries, benefits, cost of substitutes for very specific positions that serve ELs. And of course, there's the same amount of, or the same type of calculation for the special ed students and the low income students. Which I'll get into it, but that's basically how we look at, like, okay, well, at minimum, what do we need to have covered to serve these students, which we called adequacy target, which again, if you think about it, it's literally like, this is the targeted number, this is the specific number that we need to adequately serve this group of students. So basically what happens is then, so that amount, we divide by the base funding minimum amount for the entire district, and then again, that's sort of how the calculation comes about to find the specific amount that is attributable to ELs. One thing to mention that is very important is that these amounts are in addition to and not in lieu of funding. Again, thinking about using this funding to supplement services, not supplant. It's a term that we use a lot with like the title grants, so you might be familiar with that. But again, thinking about what is already being provided to the general student population, the very base minimum, to use that term. So again, in addition to, not in lieu of, all these other services that the students should be provided. Okay, so EBF calculates a ratio that is specific to each district. So this ratio includes the resources that districts are already receiving from state, local sources, local funding sources. And then those amounts are divided by the adequacy target, which I already kind of briefly ran over. So again, adequacy target is the number, the cost that at minimum is what we need to serve these students. Again, the cost is calculated based on these ratios of positions within a district, thinking about teachers, guidance counselors, psychiatrists, et cetera, as well as these specific supports that EL students need. And then also special ed, low income. So that number, the cost of education within that district, again, is what gives us the adequacy target. So we take that number, we divide it by the final resources that districts have, again, local funds, state funds, things like that. And that gives us the district's final percent of adequacy. So again, it's looking at what does a district need, like what is the final number of like, this is what a district needs to serve all these students versus, okay, well, what funding is available? So that's sort of what that final percent of adequacy means. So here are the ratios that are used to calculate the cost of an education within a district. So for ELs, you can see that for every 125 English learners, there must be one intervention teacher. For every 100 ELs, there must be one EL core teacher, and so on and so forth. So this information is what informs the calculations that we were just talking about on the previous slide in terms of determining a district's final percent of adequacy. And again, we're talking about resources divided by their need. A very important thing to mention is that this information does not dictate how a district should spend their funds, but simply just informs a district's overall need in terms of what they need to do to adequately serve these students. Okay, so how do we even calculate this in the first place? So EL enrollment is gathered at 2 points in the year on October 1st and on March 1st, and then the average of those two numbers is taken. ISB uses the greater of either a 3-year enrollment or the most recent year of enrollment to then inform the student ratios that we saw on the previous slide. So there's two benefits to doing both. It's like, well, why would you do either one? So if we're taking the 3-year average, then that's going to benefit districts that have a decreasing number of ELs versus if we're taking the most recent year of enrollment, that's going to benefit districts that have an increasing number of ELs. So just something to think about. One last thing to note is that to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, we did actually change things a little bit. So the EL enrollment for FY21 was actually represented by the greater of the actual FY21 enrollment or the FY20 enrollment compared to the 3-year average. Again, just to give districts a little bit of help because of what's been going on with the pandemic. And something that's great about that was that that adjustment actually benefited over 80% of districts who saw a decline in average student enrollment in FY21 as compared to FY20. So on this slide, we have an example of how the student ratios are calculated. You'll see that the most recent EL, or the most recent year, was taken for the EL enrollment because that's greater than the 3-year average. And then that number is what was used to calculate this, the positions. Sorry, my computer's not working all of a sudden. I'm trying to use this. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, we're back. We're live. So again, had the FY20 enrollment been larger than FY21 enrollment, then under the allowances for adjusting for impacts due to COVID-19, the FY20 enrollment would have been used in place of the FY21 enrollment. Okay, so by using the calculations of the positions on the previous slide, we then multiply them by the average teacher salary, and then we factor in other costs like benefits and cost for substitute teachers. And again, that is what gives us the, oh my gosh, just doing it again. That's what gives us the EL cost in terms of a district's adequacy target. Oh, there we go. Sorry, still struggling over here with technology. Okay, so again, we take that number, we divide it by the district's overall adequacy target, and that gives us the share of tier funding that is attributable specifically to ELs. So if the calculation shows us that 5% of a district's adequacy target is attributable to ELs, then 5% of their tier funding goes to ELs as well and should be expended as such. Please note that per Article 14C of the school code, at least 60% of a school district's state funds that are attributable to ELs must be used for instructional costs of programs and services for ELs. So again, at least 60% of a school district's state funds that are attributable to ELs must be used for instructional costs of programs and services for ELs. Great. So if you go to the link on this slide, you'll be able to see the state student funding allocations for each district. And again, that's going to include not only ELs, but the special ed and low income numbers as well. Again, for this year, districts will be receiving tiered funding as opposed to last year when districts did not. So hopefully that will be a nice addition to this year. And again, the base funding minimum for this year will be the total amount that they received last year. And then hopefully in subsequent years, we will continue to have tier funding so that the funding will hopefully continue growing. Again, to just note again, with EBF, you'll never receive less or fewer funds than you received the year before. And yeah, hopefully this will help to encourage more equitable programs and services for some of the districts that have less access to local funds and things like that. So that is a little bit of my segment. We're actually going to have a poll now, so we're going to be diving into this real quick, and then my colleague Natasha will then be jumping into the next section on the spending plan.
And that poll is the same link that you used for the last one. So if you still have that link pulled up, if you want to go back to the menti.com and type in that code, true or false, EBF still maintains funding allocation specific to English learners. And is it letting you all submit? Seeing people respond. There we go. And we are overwhelmingly getting that true response. And yes, that is true. There are still EBF specific allocations within the EBF funding formula. And again, those allocations are based on evidence-based ratios for best practices, but districts do have flexibility in how they choose to spend their funds. And we've got true, yes. Okay. So the next section of our presentation is going to look at how can a district collaboratively decide how to spend their evidence-based funding that is attributable to English learners. So the way that districts let the state know or let ISB know how they are going to spend or plan their spending of their evidence-based funding is through what's called the EBF Spending Plan. The spending plan is created by statute, And the statute says that organizational units, which go beyond districts and also include laboratory schools and regional offices of education, as well as intermediate service centers, must complete an annual spending plan that describes, one, how their total EBF dollars will be spent, and then also how their EBF dollars specifically allocated for English learners, special education, and low-income students will be spent. And these groups have to fill out this spending plan regardless of the amount of EBF dollars they receive, and it's due by September 30th of each year. Currently, there are 3 parts to the EBF spending plan. The first part looks at what strategies will drive the district's efforts to achieve student growth and make progress towards state education goals. So again, specifically looking at student growth and state education goals. And this portion of the plan is most effectively completed if led by district program leaders, that's you all, in consultation with district finance leaders. So we really do encourage you all to be at the table when this spending plan is filled out. There are call-out allocations specifically for EL students, and so ISB encourages districts to make sure that you all are at the table in deciding how those funds are most effectively spent for your students. The second part of the plan is what will you do with your evidence-based funding and why? And this part is most effectively completed if led by district finance leaders in consultation with program leaders. And so this part of the plan really looks at the data and considers how the data can be used to determine how a district should best allocate its EBF dollars. We're going the wrong way. And then the final part of the EBF spending plan as it currently stands looks at how a district will support special student groups through evidence-based funds. And this again is most effectively completed if led by district program leaders in consultation with district finance leaders. The most important questions for English learner and bilingual program directors fall under this third part of the plan. It's questions 16 and 17 currently. And so those questions really consider or really lay out what the plan should be for EL students. As Maddie already said, part of this states that at least 60% of a school district state funds attributable to ELs must be used for instructional costs of programs and services for ELs, and that's anything that falls under Function 1000 in the Illinois Program Accounting Manual. And again, these funds in the call-out part for English learners, these are allocations that are on top of what all students already receive. So these allocations are what, in addition to what all students, the general student population is receiving, what additional will be done to support EL students. Part 3 of the plan also provides an opportunity for identification of the specific ways in which funds allocated for target groups will be specifically used to support those groups, as I just said. This means for EL students, the district is asked to identify the additional supports that the students will receive. Districts can also currently and this portion is optional, districts can optionally indicate the dollar amount that will be allocated for each kind of support and can optionally provide a narrative explaining the decision. So this is really a place where districts can lay out exactly how much of their EBF funding will be spent on each portion of support for EL students and explain why those decisions were made. There is also a supplement to the English learner portion of the plan that really works to ensure accountability. So the English learner assurances, one, districts must assure that at least 60% of their state funds attributable to ELs will be used for instructional costs, as we've already said. And then for applicable districts, there is also the assurance that the Bilingual Parent Advisory Council has reviewed the EBS spending plan. So there is a BPAC review that is required for districts that have a BPAC. And for those districts, the name of the Bilingual Parent Advisory Council chair and the date of the meeting for their EBS spending plan review is required for the plan to be submitted. This year, there is a new portion, which I believe about, when I looked at our data yesterday, about 12 districts have taken advantage of. I know a lot of times with the September 30th due date, districts have not had their bilingual parent advisory council meet yet. And so a lot of districts, the feedback that we were getting was with the due date, it's not working for our BPAC to have an opportunity to review this in time. And so this year, there was an option for districts to push the bilingual or to submit by September 30th, but also allow the bilingual parent advisory council to review it by October 30th. So there was an additional month for those districts to make sure their BPAC does get to review it, and the spending plan is considered conditionally submitted up until the point that that review does happen. In addition to the assurances around EL funding, because we do have that 60% requirement for EL expenditures, that 60% of funding must be spent on instructional costs. There is also an English learner EBF expenditure report, and that's the EL EBF expenditure report. So organizational units that receive more than $5,000 in EL EBF funds must submit an expenditure report detailing how those funds were expended. And any funds not expended in the prior fiscal year do not expire, but they do roll over and will appear in the current fiscal year report. And again, it's affirming that 60% requirement. The report is due annually by July 20th, and it is located in Iowa's. So we've gone through what the EBF spending plan has looked like for the last 2 years. Right now, something we are working on is revamping this plan. Part of the ISB process of redesigning the EBS spending plan is to make it of greater value to districts. So we believe that there is significant value in the EBS spending plan that has yet to be tapped. The redesign will ultimately result in the EBS spending plan no longer being an isolated plan or a standalone submission, but we plan to integrate this plan into another already existing plan as determined by an advisory group, which we will be convening in the next few months. The ultimate goal of the redesign is to create a plan that districts find that helps reduce their planning burden. So right now, there are a lot of different plans that are out there that districts have to fill out, planning not only for their target student groups, but for students overall. And so our hope is to take this plan and reduce that burden, specifically in relation to the 3 target groups, that being low income, students from low income backgrounds, students who are special education students, and then also students who are English learners. So this is where we are currently with the redesign. We have begun developing an advisory team of districts and advocacy organizations who will be our primary contacts for this piece. The advisory group will provide insight on a value proposition for the EBS spending plan, so they will let us know what really is the value of the EBS spending plan for districts. How can this plan be of a better support to districts as they're planning how to support their student groups? The advisory group will also provide recommendations on the substantive content of the EBS spending plan. So for the last 2 years, there have not been changes to the EBS spending plan, but that will be changing. That plan will be updating. And then the advisory group will also provide recommendations for where the EBS spending plan should be integrated. Right now, the feedback that we've heard is potentially the consolidated district plan, if you all are familiar with that. Or also we've heard some thoughts around integrating it into the budget. But ultimately, that is going to be a decision that the advisory group will make. And then our goal is to have a fully redesigned and implemented EBS spending plan by FY24. And so if you have any thoughts or if you have experiences with the EBS spending plan or thoughts of how this plan could better support EL students, please send those thoughts to ebsspendingplan@isb.net so that we can take that into consideration as we are making these adjustments. And so that is what we have at this time. We are going to open it for question and answer. There are microphones in the middle, so if you have questions, you can step to the microphone. Or, yes.